They said the island would fall in 3 days. 3 days to land, fight, secure the airfield, and move on. That was the promise made to the men who loaded into landing craft beneath the blinding sun of September 15, 1944. They believed it. They had to believe it, because believing anything else would have meant facing the impossible. For months they had fought their way across the Pacific, Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, each island another scar on the map and another memory that would never leave them. They thought Peleliu would be the same. Smaller. Simpler. Quicker. It would not be. The sea was calm that morning, impossibly blue. The kind of beauty that feels wrong before a storm. The men in the Higgins boats stared at the water, their helmets reflecting sunlight, the smell of diesel heavy in the air. Some prayed. Some stayed silent. Others forced jokes, the kind that never sounded real. Ahead of them lay a strip of sand and coral that looked like paradise from afar. But beneath that surface waited 1,000 unseen guns, all aimed at the same place, the beach where they were about to land. When the ramps dropped, hell opened. Machine guns crackled from invisible holes in the cliffs. Mortars screamed through the air. The first men out of the boats disappeared in red mist. The air itself seemed to burn, filled with smoke, sand, and the metallic taste of blood. Those who made it to shore dove behind coral ridges, their hands raw from the rock's jagged edges. The sun was merciless, baking the sand until it felt like fire. Within minutes, canteens were empty. Within an hour, bodies covered the tide line. They had trained for battle. They had not trained for this. The Japanese had changed their tactics. Gone were the suicidal banzai charges that had defined earlier fights. Instead, they hid beneath the island, inside caves and tunnels carved from limestone. The surface looked empty, but death lived just below it. Every time the Marines thought they had cleared an area, the enemy would reappear behind them, emerging from hidden trapdoors and firing from new angles. There was no front line, no safe zone, no rear area. The entire island was a kill box. The men fought forward anyway. Because that was what Marines did. They crossed the airfield under a sun so hot it melted the grease on their rifles. The ground shimmered like glass, and every step kicked up clouds of white dust that stuck to sweat and blood alike. Mortar shells exploded around them, sending coral shards through skin and bone. When they reached the far side, panting and blistered, they realized the airfield had been a trap. The true battlefield lay ahead, the Umurbergal Mountains, a twisted maze of cliffs and caves that would consume them for the next 2 months. Inside those ridges, the Japanese commander, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, watched through binoculars. His defenses were intact. His men, hidden deep underground, waited in silence. He did not plan to repel the Americans at the beach. He planned to bleed them dry. The Marines began climbing the coral slopes, each ridge another fortress. Every cave had interlocking fields of fire. Every path was covered by snipers. Flamethrowers became the only weapon that worked. Men would crawl forward under fire, press the trigger, and watch orange fire flood into the darkness. The heat was unbearable. The smell that followed was worse. Even veterans gagged when they passed those caves afterward. There was no clean death here. Only burning, screaming, and the echo of gunfire trapped inside rock. Days blurred together. The heat never relented. Temperatures climbed above 115 degrees. Water ran out daily. Resupply convoys tried to bring canteens through the surf, but many boats never reached shore. Some men drank from puddles filled with oil and blood. Others filled their canteens with seawater and prayed it wouldn't kill them. Dysentery spread through the ranks. Skin rotted under bandages. Flies covered everything that didn't move, and much that did. At night, the island came alive. Japanese soldiers crept through the lines, stabbing in the dark, whispering to each other before vanishing again into the tunnels. Marines slept with their fingers on triggers. They learned to tell the difference between the sound of footsteps and the sound of the wind. Some never slept at all. After a week, half the regiment was gone. The replacements who arrived looked into the faces of the survivors and saw ghosts. Some of the men talked to corpses as if they were still alive. Others stared at the horizon, unmoving, waiting for something, anything, that wasn't more killing. And yet every morning, the order came, attack again. One sergeant, covered in dust and blood, looked at his men before another assault. "We're not fighting for the island anymore," he said. "We're fighting to live until sundown." They fought ridge by ridge, cave by cave. Flamethrowers roared, demolitions thundered, and the coral itself seemed to bleed. The Japanese refused to retreat, refused to surrender. When a position was lost, survivors crawled through tunnels and attacked again from behind. Every advance cost lives measured not in yards but in feet. Among the chaos, moments of impossible courage emerged. Corpsmen ran into open fire to reach the wounded. Men shared their last mouthful of water with strangers. A machine gunner held his position until his barrel melted, his hands blistered to the metal. A flamethrower operator, shot through the leg, dragged himself forward on his elbows to burn a cave still firing on his squad. None of them thought of medals. They thought only of each other. Night fell over a landscape of fire. The ridges glowed orange from burning caves. The air smelled of smoke, oil, and death. Somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled with orders that no one could follow. In the darkness, wounded men whispered for help that never came. By the 10th day, the division was exhausted. Entire companies had vanished. Reinforcements from the Army's 81st Division arrived to take over sectors the Marines could no longer hold. Fresh soldiers stepped onto ground so churned with bones and debris it barely resembled soil. The Marines watched them go with hollow eyes. They were no longer fighting for victory. They were simply trying to survive long enough to leave. They moved into the ridges, places with names that sounded harmless until they saw them: Bloody Nose Ridge, Five Sisters, the Horseshoe. Each was a fortress carved by nature and perfected by human hands. The coral cliffs sliced through boots and flesh. The heat turned rifles into brands. The smell of rot never left. They fought uphill through terrain that chewed men apart, only to lose the same ground hours later. The Japanese held their fire until the Marines were close enough to see their eyes, then unleashed explosions that made the earth itself shake. Blood mixed with dust, turning into a paste that coated everything. The wounded begged for water that didn't exist. Medics crawled through sniper fire with morphine syringes clutched between their teeth. For every hill taken, there was another waiting, higher, crueler. The battle was no longer about strategy or orders. It was about endurance, how long flesh and wood could resist before breaking. At night, the air was still and hot, thick with the stench of death. Men could hear the enemy digging in the darkness, shifting stones, whispering prayers. The Japanese never slept. Neither did the Americans. Every shadow was a threat, every sound a warning. A cough could get you killed. A whisper could betray a position. They learned to move like ghosts, silent and slow, eyes wide in the darkness. By the end of September, the lines had barely moved. Whole platoons vanished inside the ridges. The coral absorbed the explosions, muffling the thunder into a constant, living hum. Men spoke less and less. Words had no power here. They communicated with glances, nods, small gestures. They lived in a world reduced to noise and instinct. Those who broke under the strain were sent to the rear, shaking, eyes empty. Others begged to go back, unable to leave their friends behind. One Marine wrote in his journal, "It's not courage that keeps us going. It's the man next to you. If he moves, you move. If he dies, you keep moving anyway." The Japanese commander, Colonel Nakagawa, watched from his command cave, his face carved from stone. He knew the end was coming but refused to surrender. His men had orders to die where they stood. He told them that each American they killed delayed the invasion of their homeland, that every drop of blood spilled here bought time for Japan. They believed him. The Americans sent flamethrowers, tanks, and bulldozers to seal the caves. The island trembled with explosions. The smell of burning flesh filled the air for days. Still, the enemy kept fighting. They dug through collapsed tunnels with bleeding hands, emerging from the smoke to fire one last burst before being cut down. The Marines started to wonder if they were fighting men or ghosts. Rain came briefly, thick and heavy, drenching everything. For a moment, the men lifted their faces to the sky, mouths open. The rain mixed with ash and blood, running in dark streams down the ridges. Then the sun returned, and the island turned into a furnace again. Letters from home arrived late, often soaked or torn. Men read them over and over, holding on to the fragments of normal life. A wife's handwriting, a child's drawing, a few words that didn't smell of smoke or fear. They folded them carefully and tucked them into helmets or shirts, close to their hearts. Some letters were never opened. By early October, the battle had become a slow grind of annihilation. The Marines advanced by yards, sometimes only feet. Every cave cleared meant more bodies, more heat, more noise. The ridges were now scarred, stripped of vegetation, cratered like the moon. The sea looked close, but it might as well have been another planet. The 1st Marine Division had been bled dry. Reinforcements arrived, but they too were swallowed by the ridges. The Japanese refused to die quickly. When the Marines thought an area was secured, gunfire would erupt again from behind them. Caves that had been sealed reopened, as if the island itself was alive and angry. One corporal, his voice hoarse from smoke, said, "We're not fighting men anymore. We're fighting Peleliu itself." The officers stopped counting days. They measured time in attacks, in losses, in how many men they had left who could still stand. Rations were half what they should have been. The wounded rotted in the heat before evacuation came. The smell of decay hung over everything like a fog. Yet somehow, they kept going. When the 81st Army Division took over sections of the line, they found Marines barely able to speak, their faces burned black by the sun, their uniforms stiff with salt and blood. The new soldiers tried to talk to them, to ask what it was like. The Marines just stared and said, "You'll see." The army fought with fresh energy, but even they soon learned the truth. There was no winning here, only surviving long enough to call it victory. They advanced through a maze of rock and fire where the enemy seemed endless. They learned the same rhythms, the same exhaustion, the same slow erosion of fear until nothing was left but motion. By the end of the 2nd month, the ridges were quieting. The Japanese were dying of thirst, starvation, and wounds that no one could treat. Still they fought, crawling out of holes to die in the open. Colonel Nakagawa, knowing it was over, gathered his officers, burned the regimental flag, and performed seppuku. When the Americans found his body, his pistol still rested beside him, his orders neatly stacked on the table. The Marines stood in silence. There was no celebration, no cheering. They had won nothing that felt like victory. The island was theirs, but it had cost them everything. When they finally left Peleliu, many refused to look back. The sea that had brought them now carried them away, the sun reflecting on the waves like fire. They were thin, hollow, burned, and scarred. Some would never recover. Some would never speak of it again. Back home, headlines mentioned Peleliu only briefly. It was overshadowed by the invasion of the Philippines, by bigger battles and larger names. The men who fought there read the papers and said nothing. They knew the truth. That small island had been a crucible that burned away everything but survival. For those who came back, the war never truly ended. They carried Peleliu inside them, in the smell of smoke that lingered, in the heat that never faded, in the silence that followed gunfire. Some avoided beaches for the rest of their lives, unable to hear the ocean without tasting dust and blood. Others woke in the night, clawing for air, believing they were still underground, trapped in the caves. They had been told the battle would last 3 days. It lasted 73. And for those who lived through it, it never ended at all. When the survivors reached the transport ships waiting offshore, they barely spoke. Salt crusted their uniforms. Their eyes were sunken and unfocused. The Navy crews who helped them aboard stared in shock. These were not the proud, roaring Marines from recruiting posters. These were ghosts, wrapped in bandages, their hands trembling, their faces cracked and burned. Some carried helmets belonging to friends who hadn't made it. Others refused to remove their packs, as if letting go of that weight meant leaving something behind they couldn't afford to lose. The medics worked in silence. They poured water over cracked lips, Cut-open boots fused to swollen feet, dressed wounds that had festered for weeks. A few men cried quietly when they felt cool air on their skin for the first time in months. One Marine, delirious from fever, kept asking where his platoon was. No one had the heart to tell him he was the only one left. As the ships turned toward the horizon, Peleliu shrank into a green smudge behind them. It should have been a moment of relief, but for many, it felt like abandonment. The island had become a nightmare, but it had also become their entire world. Every noise, every movement, every heartbeat had been tied to its burning ridges. Now there was only silence and the sound of engines. Some men stared back until the island vanished, as if expecting to see someone waving goodbye from the beach. Back on safer islands, they were given food, new uniforms, clean beds. Reporters came, cameras flashed, officers spoke about courage and sacrifice. The men listened but didn't hear. They ate slowly, methodically, as if every bite might disappear. They slept without helmets for the first time in weeks, but many woke screaming. In the morning, they pretended it hadn't happened. Letters home spoke of victory, of pride, of duty. But the words felt wrong in their mouths. The families would never understand. How could they? How could anyone picture the ridges, the heat, the smell, the sound of a man burning alive inside a cave? The only people who truly understood were the ones who had been there, and even they didn't want to talk about it. They carried it quietly, like a scar you can't show. Historians would later debate whether Peleliu had any purpose. Some generals admitted it could have been bypassed entirely. But decisions are easy to judge from a map. For the men on the ground, there was no strategy, no grand vision, only survival. The airfield they were told was vital was little more than a cracked strip of coral by the time the fighting ended. The planes that were supposed to use it never came. The cost was immeasurable. Colonel Nakagawa's body was found in his bunker days after his suicide. His men had fought to the last, their remains scattered through the caves and tunnels. They had believed they were protecting Japan. The Marines who buried them understood that belief too well. They had fought for something they barely remembered, something distant and abstract. What remained between them was not hatred but recognition. Both sides had lived through the same inferno. On the decks of the ships heading home, the survivors stood in small groups, smoking in silence. They watched the waves break against the hull. The sea that had once seemed endless now felt small, trapped between memory and forgetting. Some of them made promises. To write down what happened, to visit the families of the men who didn't come back, to make the world understand. Most never did. Words were too fragile. When they finally reached the States, the world around them had already moved on. Factories roared, parades marched, newspapers shouted about victories in the Philippines and Europe. Peleliu was a brief mention in a column, a forgotten headline buried under newer triumphs. But in the minds of those who had been there, the island never stopped burning. They built lives as best they could. They worked, married, raised children. But there were moments, always moments, when the past returned. The smell of diesel, the sound of rain on metal, the glare of a summer afternoon. It would come back without warning, as vivid as the day it happened. Their wives would find them staring out the window, lost somewhere far away, their hands trembling. When asked what was wrong, they would shake their heads and say, "Nothing. Just thinking." Some of them reunited years later, gray-haired and slower. They met at memorials or reunions, men who had once been 20 and invincible. They spoke softly, laughed quietly, shared stories that no one else could hear. They looked into each other's eyes and saw the same ghosts looking back. There was comfort in that, proof that what they remembered was real. One veteran returned to Peleliu decades later. The island was covered in green again. Birds sang in trees that had once been blackened stumps. He walked the ridges, now silent, and felt the heat rising from the ground. He found rusted helmets, twisted rifles, the remains of a tank half swallowed by the earth. He stood there for hours, listening to the wind moving through the grass. It sounded like voices. He picked up a piece of coral, white and smooth, and whispered to it, "We made it." Then he put it back down. Some things shouldn't be taken from the island. The memory of Peleliu lives not in history books, but in the silence between words, in the eyes of the men who never forgot. It's there in the trembling hand of an old marine lighting a cigarette. It's there in the faint scars on his wrists, the way he flinches at sudden noise. It's there in the way he looks at the ocean, not as something beautiful, but as something ancient and indifferent. The war ended, but Peleliu didn't. It exists in the space between the living and the dead, between duty and regret. It's the whisper that says, "We survived, but not all of us came home." Those who fought there carried the island with them to their graves. Some said their last words were names from long ago, friends who never left the coral ridges. Others simply closed their eyes and smiled, as if seeing something the rest of us never could. For the world, Peleliu is a footnote, a forgotten battle and a war of giants. But for the men who walked its burning ground, it was eternity compressed into 73 days. The air, the heat, the sound of gunfire echoing off stone, it never faded. When you stand on that island today, you can hear the waves breaking against coral. You can see sunlight on the water. It looks peaceful. But if you listen closely, if you stand still enough, you might hear it too, the faint murmur beneath the wind, the heartbeat of a place that remembers. And in that whisper is everything they left behind: courage, fear, sacrifice, and the quiet truth that war never really ends. It just waits, buried under the surface, until someone remembers. The years moved on, slow and merciless. For the veterans of Peleliu, time did not heal, it only made the memories quieter, more selective, but no less vivid. They learned to live beside the ghosts, to carry them like a second skin. The world around them forgot the island's name, yet inside their minds it was always there, baked into the coral of their thoughts. Sometimes they would smell smoke that wasn't there, or hear waves that weren't crashing. In those moments they were back on the beach again, 20 years old and afraid, the sun blinding, the air trembling with gunfire. Some of them tried to tell their children. They sat at dinner tables, staring at faces that couldn't understand. They started sentences that ended with silence. "It was hot," they would say, or, "We lost a lot of good men." That was all. The rest stayed locked behind their eyes, where the screams and fire could not escape. A few wrote it down in notebooks hidden in drawers, pages filled with fragments of memory, half sentences, sketches of ridges, the names of friends they couldn't forget. When they died, their families found those notebooks and wondered who the words were for. The world called them heroes, but they never used that word. To them, heroism had burned away in the heat of the ridges. There had been no glory, only survival. They had seen too much, done too much, to believe in clean stories of good and evil. They had looked into the faces of their enemies, and seen the same fear reflected back. They had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to move despite it. Some went back to school, built careers, raised children. Others drifted, unable to settle. The noise of cities reminded them of shellfire, the smell of gasoline, of flamethrowers. The world felt too loud, too fast. They sought quiet places, fields, forests, small towns by the sea. Even there, the quiet sometimes turned against them, echoing too close to the silence of the tunnels. Every year, on the anniversary of the landing, a few of them gathered. Not many. Each year there were fewer. They met in small halls or under memorials carved with names few remembered. They didn't talk about tactics or strategy. They talked about the heat, the thirst, the laughter of a friend before the shell hit. They shared cigarettes, told the same jokes, laughed at things that weren't funny. When the moment came to honor the dead, they stood in silence, eyes closed, and in their minds the ridges rose again, white and burning. The historians tried to capture Peleliu in words, in numbers, casualties, days, tons of bombs dropped. They called it unnecessary, a miscalculation. They wrote that it had no strategic value. They were right, maybe. But for the men who fought there, the meaning was carved in a different measure. It was in the faces they still saw in their dreams, in the scars they traced with their fingers in the dark. It was in the simple truth that they had gone to a place beyond reason and come back changed forever. The Japanese who had defended the island left their own ghosts behind. Decades later, their families came to search for the remains of fathers and brothers. They walked the same ridges, now overgrown, and prayed into the stillness. American veterans sometimes met them there, exchanging bows, tears, words either side fully understood. There was no anger left, only the shared weight of memory. They understood each other without translation. Peleliu itself seemed to breathe again. The jungle returned, wrapping the scars of war in green. Trees grew from craters, roots twisted through rusted helmets. Nature, indifferent and patient, reclaimed everything. But beneath that calm lay the bones, thousands of them, American and Japanese alike, silent witnesses to what humanity is capable of when pushed beyond limits. The island remembered, even if the world didn't. Visitors who walk there today find relics half buried in soil, bullets, canteens, fragments of bone. Some take them as souvenirs, others leave them untouched. The locals say the island is haunted, that sometimes at night you can hear footsteps in the ridges, whispers in the caves. Maybe it's just the wind. Or maybe it's the echo of 73 days that never really ended. One old Marine, near the end of his life, was asked if he regretted going. He thought for a long time, then said quietly, "No. But I wish it had meant something." He looked away then, his eyes distant, seeing something no one else could see. For him, the war had never been about patriotism or victory. It had been about survival, about holding on to a small piece of humanity when everything else was stripped away. In his final years, he would sit on his porch at sunset, staring at the horizon. When asked what he was looking for, he would smile and say, "The tide." But in his eyes there was always that island, white sand, black smoke, and the faces of boys who never got to grow old. The story of Peleliu is not one of triumph, but of endurance. It is the story of men thrown into a place designed to break them, and somehow, they did not break. They bent, they burned, they bled, but they did not break. That is what remains when the medals tarnish and the parades fade away. The quiet strength of those who faced hell and came back carrying its shadow. War is remembered by dates and victories, but what matters are the moments that never make it to the textbooks. The hand gripping another in the dark, the whispered prayer, the promise to a dying friend that he won't be forgotten. Those moments are the truth of Peleliu. Those moments are what history forgets but memory keeps alive. And so the island sleeps, surrounded by a calm sea that once ran red. The waves wash over the coral, erasing footprints, smoothing scars. But beneath that surface, the story remains, waiting to be told again, not as a tale of glory, but as a warning. Because Peleliu was proof that even victory can destroy the victors, and that sometimes, the greatest courage is simply enduring what cannot be endured. In the final years of their lives, the survivors of Peleliu became living relics of a time that the world preferred not to remember. When they walked into veterans' halls, younger men from later wars would stand and shake their hands, calling them legends. The old Marines smiled politely, but inside they felt none of that. Legends belong to stories, and stories have endings. What happened on Peleliu had no ending. It lived in them every day, in the ache of old wounds, in the heat that never seemed to leave their bones. The nightmares came less often, but they never stopped. They would dream of tunnels and the sound of dripping water, of sand turning to glass under the sun, of voices calling their names from somewhere deep underground. Some nights they would wake in a cold sweat, clutching the sheets, gasping for air. Their wives would ask what was wrong, and they would simply say, "Just a dream," though they knew it wasn't. It was memory, alive and patient. When documentaries were made decades later, cameras turned toward them again. They sat in front of microphones, faces lined with age, and tried to describe what it had been like. Some couldn't. Others spoke quietly, their voices trembling as if afraid to wake the ghosts. They said words like heat, thirst, fear, and brotherhood, but the truth lay between them, in the pauses. One man said, "You can't tell it. You can only carry it." The island itself changed little. Tourists came to snorkel in its waters, unaware of what slept beneath them. A few historians and relatives of the dead still came to walk the ridges. They found shells fused into coral, fragments of human bone, rusted dog tags etched with names. They took photographs, left flowers, whispered prayers. Some said they could feel something watching them, not menacing, but heavy, like the weight of history pressing against the air. Peleliu's jungles grew thick again. Vines hung over the entrances of caves that once spat fire. Inside those caves, bats roost where soldiers had once crouched with rifles. Roots split old bunkers apart, reclaiming them inch by inch. Nature had forgiven what man had done, but it had not forgotten. The earth still held the stories, still exhaled the echoes of 73 days of madness. Among the ruins, a rusted helmet sits half buried in soil. Inside it, a small tree grows, its roots curling through the steel. It is the most honest monument the island could have, death giving birth to life, war feeding the peace that came after. One historian wrote that Peleliu was the cost of learning how not to fight a war. That it showed the world the limits of planning, of pride, of command made blind by certainty. The generals who ordered it believed in maps and numbers. The men who fought it believed in each other. The island crushed both beliefs, leaving behind only truth, that war is chaos, that bravery has a price, and that sometimes, survival itself is the only victory. Years later, one of the last surviving officers of the 1st Marine Division stood at a ceremony marking the anniversary of the battle. He was frail, his hands shaking as he held a piece of coral from the island. Reporters leaned in, waiting for grand words about duty and honor. He looked at the crowd, then down at the coral, and said softly, "We were told it would take 3 days." He paused, the silence heavy. It took everything. Then he walked away. For those who listen closely, Peleliu still speaks. Not in language, but in feeling, the oppressive heat, the hum of insects, the stillness that follows destruction. It is a whisper in the bones of anyone who has seen what war truly is. It says, remember? Not to glorify, but to understand. Because forgetting means repeating. The island stands now as a small green shape in a vast ocean, peaceful under the sun. Children play on beaches where men once died. Fishermen cast nets where landing craft burned. Life has returned, indifferent to what came before. But the soil is still mixed with ashes, and sometimes, after heavy rain, bones rise from the earth, pale against the dark ground. The locals bury them again, gently, without asking which side they belong to. There are no sides left on Peleliu. Only memory. The ocean around the island glows at sunset, turning gold and red. To someone who doesn't know, it's beautiful. To someone who remembers, it looks like fire. And maybe that's fitting. Because Peleliu was fire, consuming everything it touched, leaving behind nothing but light and shadow, heat and silence. It burned men into legends they never wanted to be, and then it burned those legends into dust. What remains are the stories, told in quiet rooms, between old men who once called each other brothers. They speak not of victory, but of survival, not of strategy, but of faces, not of glory, but of endurance. They speak because someone must. Because if they don't, the island wins again. When the last of them is gone, when their voices fade into the sea, Peleliu will still be there, patient, silent, eternal. The waves will keep breaking against coral. The wind will keep whispering through the ridges. And in that sound, if you listen, you might hear them still, the echo of boots on sand, the hiss of flamethrowers, the cries of men too young to understand why they were there. They said it would take 3 days. It took 73. And for the men who fought there, it took the rest of their lives to leave.